For most Americans, debt isn't just a financial burden. It's the single biggest obstacle standing between them and freedom. According to the Federal Reserve, the average U.S. household carries over $104,000 in debt, and 40% say that debt keeps them awake at night. Today's guest knows exactly how that feels. Years ago, debt nearly destroyed his marriage and drove him to the edge. But through discipline, structure, and stewardship, he and his wife not only turned it around, they've helped clients around the world pay off more than $1 million of debt in total. Together, we explore how systems, not willpower, can make debt elimination possible for anyone. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Escape the Clock, the show where we highlight strategies and approaches for achieving financial freedom and having the option not to work. I'm your host, Daniel C. Rogers. We've talked a lot on the show about investing, real estate, and building wealth, but every successful plan to escape the clock begins in the same place, getting out of debt. And debt steals your freedom, your energy, your ability to make choices. And before you can design a future on your own terms, you have to break free of its grip. 60% of adults live paycheck to paycheck. And over half of them say debt payments consume more than a quarter of their entire monthly income. Trying to keep your head above water like that can create a tunneling effect, where every decision becomes short-term, reactive, and survival-driven. You stop thinking about what's possible, and you start thinking only about what's urgent. And when you're living like that, the stress compounds faster than interest ever could. And so for so many, that means the math of early retirement doesn't even pencil out until debt is under control. Well, today's guest is Scott Maderer. In 2011, Scott and his wife, Carrie, founded Inspired Stewardship to help people align how they use their time, talent, and treasures, and to regain control of their financial lives. But long before his coaching others, Scott went through a financial collapse of his own, where he and his wife were drowning in debt and the relationship on the brink and their hope fading fast. But since then, Scott has coached more than 1,000 clients across 20 countries and 38 states, helping them collectively pay off over $1 million in debt, rebuild their confidence, and take back their future. He's also the author of Inspired Living, Assemble the Puzzle of Your Calling by Mastering Your Time, Your Talent, and Your Treasures. Scott, welcome to Escape the Clock.
Absolutely. I'm so happy to be here.
I've done an education-focused episode on debt, but this is the first real conversation with someone who's like grappled with it and kind of flipped the script to your level. So I'd love to just start with that story. Can you kind of just take us back to the moment where you kind of thought, wow, everything's kind of crashing down, and what you ended up doing in that moment to decide you had to fight your way back out of it?
Absolutely. So going back, let me kind of lay the groundwork first. So I was a school teacher. My wife was a homemaker and staying home. She worked a little bit, but I was the major breadwinner. I was making about $40,000 a year. Yes, school teachers don't get paid anything. This was in the early 2000s. We had been building a house, and when I say building a house, I don't mean paying to have a house built. I mean we were actually driving nails into wood to build a house with her mother and her father, my mother and father-in-law. And so we were living in one town and driving out on the weekends to work. And then eventually we moved out there. And so it was this kind of long drawn out process. And in the process of that, we were racking up debt. And I looked up one day and realized that we had over $60,000 in debt. And again, I was making $40,000 a year. And I was being a good husband and protecting my wife from all of this and not sharing any of the details of the finances with her. By the way, my wife's a smart lady. She knew what was going on, but and she was protecting me by not talking to me and not adding to my stress because she could tell I was stressed out about it. And so in the process of that, we're not communicating. We were probably headed towards divorce, and I would drive home at night. We lived out in the country on this long curving road. And basically I began to think about, hey, if I drive off of this road and it looks like I fell asleep, insurance will pay out. My wife can pay off the debt. She'll feel a lot better. I was beginning to get suicidal because of debt. And by the way, that's the number one cause of male suicide is financial problems and financial stress. So I was following down that road. And as we're going through that, here's the irony. So I'm planning on pretending like I fall asleep, but I listen to talk radio on the way home because it's the only thing that would keep me awake. It's one of those. I tell that to people, and they're like, "That's kind of weird." It's like, yeah, I know, but that's what was happening in my head and in my mind, and it doesn't have to be logical. That's just what was happening. They changed the lineup, and I started hearing some messages. It was actually the Dave Ramsey show about getting debt free, and I began to argue with the radio on the way home, talking about how stupid this was. Nobody could do this. This was foolish. But then I realized that after about a week of that, I've been arguing with the radio instead of thinking about suicide. And on a Friday, I heard a message from a husband and a wife, and their situation wasn't identical to mine and my wife's, but there was enough touch points that were similar to make me go, maybe there's something to this. And one of the things he said that stuck in my head is, the biggest problem they had is they weren't talking about it. And as long as they weren't talking about it, there was nothing they could do about it. And I went, okay, I've got to talk to my wife. And so that weekend I took her out and we went down to the lake and sat on the back of the car. And I said, let me come clean. Here's what's going on. Here's the situation. I've been thinking about committing suicide. I heard this thing on the radio. And she goes, oh, you mean the Dave Ramsey show? Yeah, I've been listening to it during the day. So it turns out they were listening to it. Her and her dad were listening to it during the day. I'm listening to it at night. So we decided, okay, we've got to do something different. And we didn't actually work exactly what Dave Ramsey tells you to do. And we did some things that were different than their plan and that sort of thing. But what we did do is we decided we've got to talk about this. We've got to get onto one page. We've got to radically change how we're living. Now, in the midst of all of that, I ended up, as we started this journey, losing my job and changing jobs, and eventually sold cars for a little while, and then went and got a job in a corporate position and began to raise my pay that way. We began to live radically different. We ended up paying off $78,856.42. Not that I know it to the penny, in 2 years, 11 months. But we did that while making an average of $55,000. So if you kind of do 2 years, 11 months and say 78,000, by the way, some of you just caught on. I said 60 something thousand and now I'm saying 78. In the middle of that, I had emergency surgery twice. Because of a collapsed lung, once in December and once in January, which, if you know how insurance works, means I got to pay everything twice. That added to our debt through medical debt. But we went through and paid all of that off. And out of that, what ended up happening is folks were like, okay, y'all are weird. Can you help us be weird? And that's where the coaching business started, because we started helping other people with restructuring, rechanging, recommunicating, and readjusting their lives. So that's a little bit about the journey and kind of the path of us getting out of debt and again, getting past the suicidal, the divorce, the non-communication, all of those things. The debt is the symptom. The problem was all of that other stuff, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I want to get into some of the tools and stuff you used definitely to kind of chip away, because that's a massive amount you were dealing with. And I think anyone should be really paying attention here. Like, your income wasn't substantial compared to the debt, at least at that time, right? So but it still was possible. And I want to get into that, because I do know it's a cash flow game, and anyone can do it when they know the tools and they use the discipline. But before that, I would love to hear a little bit more about what that conversation with your wife was like. That I'm sure that was really hard for you, right? You had to be very open and vulnerable about a lot of stuff. Had to have been really hard for her. Like, what was that? I mean, it has to take on a lot of honesty and vulnerability to have that conversation. Did it surprise you how it went? Like, can you go a little bit more into details there?
Absolutely. It surprised me because it actually went much easier than I thought it was going to. And again, it surprised me because she actually knew a lot more than I thought she did. I thought I was protecting her, and what I was really doing was being kind of arrogant and prideful, quite frankly, and taking on a lot of roles and responsibilities and worries that I didn't need to take on, but I was doing it because I thought it was the right thing to do. She was taking on a lot of stress because she was worried about me. My wife is an empath. She kind of knows when stuff is going on without having to be told. So she knew I was really down in the dumps, but she didn't know how to fix it or how to help it. And so what it did is opened up communication because, basically what it sounded like is, hi, hon, I'm an idiot. I mean, that's kind of, I think I literally started with that. And she says, wait, what do you mean? And I said, well, look, let me tell you what's been going on. And I told her all of this. And she's like, uh-huh, I know, I can see the bank account. I can see the credit card statement. I'm not stupid. And it's like, well, I never said you were stupid, and we kind of went back and forth, and there was tears, and but there wasn't anger. There wasn't madness. There was much more of a, okay, so this is where we're at. This is the reality. What are we going to do about it? And, are we going to stay together? Is this worth fighting through? And once we kind of looked at each other and said, yeah, it's worth fighting through, I think it's worth keeping our marriage. It's worth keeping together. It's worth working through this together. So now we're on the same page. Okay, the rest of it's easy. So it was hard because I know I'm probably the only one, but I have a little bit of pride and a little bit of arrogance and a little bit of feeling like, I should be able to handle anything and I don't need help. And I know I'm the only one. Nobody else ever thinks that. And so it was coming clean on that and going, I've gotten us into this situation because, by the way, most of the debt was based on things and choices that I had made. It wasn't her. It wasn't like she was misbehaving. Now, she ran up debt too, but the vast majority of it was decisions that I had made because, again, I was making those decisions on my own, which basically means I'm losing out on 50% of the wisdom in our marriage, because again, she knows things that I don't know. She sees things that I don't see. And it's not that she's right and I'm wrong or I'm right and she's wrong. It was once we opened up communication, she could say, hey, have you thought about this? And I would legitimately go, yes, I have thought about that. And here's, why, or, I haven't thought about that. You're right. I probably need to do some more research. Let's go a little deeper, and vice versa. I could say the same thing to her. But yeah, it was definitely one of those things where it was scary to do it. But what I was shocked by is the fact that it was actually a lot easier than I thought it was going to be, in large part because I didn't approach it with the, you've done everything wrong, or this is all your fault. Or, I talked about me and what I had done. And again, she'd screwed up too. There were things she had done wrong too, but I didn't focus on those. I focused on my part of the problem and then let her talk about her part of the problem. And so it never came across as accusatory or let's draw a line in the sand about all the idiot stuff you have done. And I think that's the mistake a lot of us make when we try to talk about things like money, is we talk a lot of you statements instead of a lot of I statements.
Yeah.
You've done this wrong, as opposed to here's what I've done wrong.
There has to be some kind of accountability, in each of our roles there. So one more question on that before we kind of get into kind of where you went from there. But, there was that moment you had in the car where it sounded like you were kind of in a flight mode, but then you kind of flipped it into a fight mode. And then you humbled yourself with your wife, and then you were able to come together in a very positive way, which is great. Like I mentioned at the top, 60% of US adults are in this survival mode called the ostrich effect, right? Kind of bury your head in the sand and just keep a blinders on, and you just kind of keep going. And 43% of marriages list money stress as the number one cause of conflict. That was a Ramsey Solutions survey from 2 years ago. When you look back, at least in hindsight, why do you think you kind of got into that? Why do you think this is such a pervasive problem for so many people?
Part of it's just the messaging of our culture and what we have around us. You're constantly told you only live once, live in the moment. If you don't consume, you're not doing anything. It's all about the appearance. It's all about the facade. You should drive the nicest car. You should live in the biggest house. The appearance of and the trappings of success. And I put that in quotes because I really don't think it is success, but it's kind of what's sold to us. And so you're constantly bombarded with that messaging. That's part of it. And then the other half is, realistically, things have changed in terms of economics and the way we are paid and how much we're paid. If you plot the increase in things like home prices versus the increase in minimum wage or average wage or median wage and any of those numbers, they don't go up parallel to each other. They're approaching each other, which means things are more expensive per dollar today. And so there's some of that going on, and that's just an economic reality. So it's a combination of both economic realities, and then rather than recognizing those economic realities and going, okay, yeah, but what do I have control over? What choices can I make? What can I do? It's buying into that messaging of there's nothing you can do about it, so you might as well live large. You might as well drive the nicest car. You might as well have, you deserve it kind of messaging. And when you put those two things together, you're obviously going to end up deeply in debt and living paycheck to paycheck. And then once you're there, it's the momentum to stay there. It's a negative feedback loop where once you realize, wait a minute, I can't fix all of this. I can't go make the minimum wage more. I can't change the price of houses, but I can change the choices I'm making. I can change the decisions and how my wife and I are living. I can influence and sometimes sacrifice this for that, because that's more important to me. I don't really care anymore the commercials that are on. I don't really care anymore. When I worked in the corporate job, I eventually was making six figures. I'm making a good income. And for a while I was driving a 1999 Ford that I had bought from a estate sale, that was it literally sun bleached because it had sat parked in front of grandma's house, and there's no paint on the roof. The headliner I had to glue up because in the Texas heat, it was falling down and hit me in the head, that kind of car. And people are like, dude, you make six figures. Why are you driving that junker? And I'm like, because I don't care. It's like, I don't need to drive a BMW. I'm fine. And eventually, by the way, I drive a nicer car, but I gave up the nice car because it was more important at that time that my wife and I were doing other things. And it is a matter of recognizing what you do have control over and then taking action on those things before we really change. And I think that's a lot of the mistake is people have given up that control. They've given up that choice. They've given up that power. And so now they're trapped in that negative cycle.
Yeah, no, completely agree with that. Income is not going up faster than costs. People don't always understand the power of inflation and the power of autopilot and chasing status and what that has to do with entrenching us into that debt for sure. And it's so funny you mentioned the car because I did the same thing. I mean, the 2008 housing crisis hit us pretty hard. We ended up with multiple mortgages and trying to short sell, and it compounded a bunch of debt on us. And I just kept driving this inherited my wife's grandmother's car, and I drove it literally to the thing just died, to the point where we just donated it because I couldn't get it to move anymore. And that's the kind of, you get into that situation, you have to, like you said, take control. So let's get into that, because Fidelity had done, their behavioral finance group had done this really fascinating study that said a household that actually writes a debt elimination plan is 60% successful with becoming debt free. Just the act of creating a plan. Yep. So when you were there, what did your plan look like? Can you share some of the details?
At a high level, at the end of the day, it really boils down to one thing, make a certain amount of money, spend less than that, and do something with the difference. I mean, that's it, right? It's not rocket science. I do think you're right that the act of sitting down and making a plan has value. And by the way, that plan is not going to happen the way you wrote it down. That's the other thing to say. Now, what I will tell you is usually it happens better than the plan you wrote down, but it's not going to happen the way you wrote it down. Again, see me, 2 surgeries in the middle of getting out of debt. We added $18,000 to our debt. Didn't want to do that. That kind of thing. That's an example of plan didn't work exactly the way. But yeah, I sat down, we did a budget, a spending plan, pretty simplistic. I did it with an Excel spreadsheet. It's not anything too fancy. And we started looking through it and going, okay, what can we eliminate? What can we give up? There were some things that we chose to keep in the budget that other people would have looked at and said, oh, that's frivolous. You don't need that. But they were important to us. By the same token, there were things that we gave up that other people probably would have looked at and said, oh, I was going to keep, I would keep that. It's like, so for instance, we didn't have any sort of television, cable, streaming, nothing. We did none of that for something around 12 years. 13 years. Even after we got out of debt, we didn't go in and do that because it just wasn't valuable to us at that time. Now we have that stuff now, but then we were like, these other things are more important, So a lot of it is sitting down and doing those pros and cons. So we did the budget. The other thing on the debt part, we did start and do it basically with a debt snowball. The laugh is people are like, well, you're good at math and y'all were very disciplined. You could have used other methods. I'm like, yeah, we could have. But for us, it was really, there's a lot of different ways you can structure debt payoff. And at the end of the day, the one that's the best is the one that you actually do. So I don't really care what it is. We can talk about 50 different ways, but we did that and just worked through them sequentially. And eventually we got to the really big one at the end. But it's also the weird thing is you get real excited because my wife decided to go back to work. That was something that happened too. She did that for a couple of years. So that was part of the plan and we took pretty much all of her income was paying for debt. We were using 100% of her check to go towards debt. So it was really, I hate to say it, but it's kind of simple and basic. But honestly, that's kind of why it worked, is because we didn't try to get fancy and do any magic math tricks to make it work. We just went, all right, we got to live on less than we make.
Well, simple is always the best. I think it's great that you made all those points. I mean, you looked at your expenses. That's step one. A lot of people don't even look at it because it's just too hard, right, to even look at it. But you have to look at it. Then you have to decide how do I personalize approach that works for me? And it's awesome you did that. Do you mind sharing like how many credit cards you had and what type of interest rates and things you were dealing with?
I'll share as best I can. I may not get it all exactly right. I think when we started, I think it was 4 credit cards. It might have been 5, but I think it was 4. I think the interest rates ranged from 23% on the highest one. I think we had one that was around 12% and everything in between those. We also had a car payment when we started, and we had a card debt. It was a relatively small card debt. We only had like $3,000 or $4,000 left on it, so we were able to knock that out pretty quick. But we had a card debt. We didn't have any student loans. We didn't have any, and then in the middle of it, of course, we got medical debt, which was from the surgeries for me. But that was kind of the categories. And the medical debt, we negotiated with them, and they did it at 0% for a long time. We were able to. We went into the doctor in the hospital and said, this is our situation. This is what we're doing. Here's what we can pay you. And they worked with us. So, it honestly, it was the least intrusive of all of them. It's a couple of the credit cards. I think we had a Discover card and an no, it wasn't an American Express. Discover, Visa, and MasterCard. And I think we had 2 MasterCards, if I remember right. I think that was the 4.
And why did you decide it was better to snowball on some of the lower balance, easier ones rather than just go after that like 20% plus percent higher?
It's just momentum. It was just the ability to get rid of some of the mosquitoes. And it felt really good to be able to write $5,000 checks or $3,000 checks or, whatever it was. It kind of got to the point where it's like, you're looking forward to the payday on Friday because you were going to write a check. Which is a weird thing, but it's like, ooh, we're going to get to write, $400 check this week, or we're going to get to write a $500 check this week or whatever. Of course, eventually that was all electronic payments. But when we started, it was actually writing a check. Towards the end, it was like transfer, but it was really just momentum and emotion that for us, that was important. And again, I don't think that's the right plan for everybody or the only plan out there, but I do think there is something to be said for being able to acknowledge the fact that emotional momentum is very helpful, especially when like in the middle, we had a backstep. We had the medical debt where it's like, oh, crud, we just went backwards. Well, yeah, but by then we'd actually gotten it down to, I think we had 1 credit card, so now it's 1 credit card and medical debt. Okay. So it's a little bit more manageable.
I would love to ask you about that too, actually. And I know this didn't happen in your case, but roughly 80% of people who do try to pay off their debt do relapse within 18 months. It's a common problem. So like when you're coaching people or helping people with this, what mental traps or habits are you seeing people happening to them where they cycle back into the debt?
A lot of times it's because they haven't really fixed the problem. They've treated the symptom. Again, debt is a symptom. It's not the problem. Your budget is not the solution. It's a tool and it's important, but that is not what solves the problem. What solves the problem is you rewiring your beliefs, your behaviors, your mindsets, your habits, the systems and the processes you use. Those things, those are actually the problem. And so I think all too often people look at the goal, which is getting out of debt, and think of that as the purpose and the mission, when the real truth is the why behind it. Why do you want to get out of debt? Because guess what? The real truth, nobody wants to get out of debt. That's not what you want. You want freedom, you want flexibility, you want to be in a situation. I'm in a situation today where I work, but technically my wife and I would probably be okay if I didn't. And we're blessed like that because we've set ourselves up to be in that situation because that was important to us. And we've made the hard choices to get to a place where that's not the situation anymore. But that is because that's something that we wanted, that freedom. We wanted that flexibility. We wanted to be able to do things and to give more and to give things to my son and help other people. And those things were what's really important. And I think more often than not, when people relapse, it's because all they addressed was the symptom of we're in debt, but they really didn't go back to the fundamentals of what are the beliefs, what are the behaviors, what are the habits, what are the mindsets that are putting you in debt.
I mean, you've helped over 1,000 clients eliminate $1 million in debt. Obviously, these systems and mindsets really work. So like when you've been working with these clients for all these years who are now staying debt free, what are the common habits or systems that are really helping them live that way?
At the end of the day, it's simply intentionality and paying attention. I mean, that's the shorthand answer. What does that look like? Well, quite frankly, it looks different for different people. But it usually involves at some level, they're continuing to do planning, call that a spending plan, a budget, whatever you want. It's bigger than that, though. It's planning in terms of they're thinking about what's important to us today, what's important to us in the future, what are the risks that we're willing to tolerate? What are the risks that we're not willing to tolerate? It turns out that risk management becomes part of the conversation, future planning for possibilities. I've got one gentleman that he's been working with me for over 10 years. And, we've kind of worked through, he's opened different businesses during that time. So we've gone through creating businesses, closing businesses, getting married, getting divorced, now on track to maybe get remarried, all of these massive life changes. And the truth is, at the end of the day, it still comes down to plan. Guess what? Things change. Okay, great. Now we need to adjust that. I talk about it in terms of refocus, gain control, and set a plan. That's not a line, though. That's a circle. So you refocus, look at what's going on. Really, this is looking at your expenses. This is looking at your behavior. This is looking at your debt. This is look at the reality. You may not like it, but look at it. You got to know what's real and then gain control. That's starting to inject things like that could be a spending plan, that could be a debt elimination plan, that could be other tools like auto deposits or auto payroll or moving money around, having an emergency fund. All of these things, those are all just tools that are methodologies to gain control. Now you've got a plan. You start following the plan. And then life happens. Inevitably something will change. And when it changes, you got to go back to refocus. You got to stop and look again. And you got to go, okay, what's changed? What hasn't changed? Is it something that's changed in me? Something that I didn't think was important. I never dreamed about starting my own business, but now all of a sudden, because all of this is happening, it's kind of got me excited about this dream that I had 40 years ago that I'd forgotten about. And now I want to go do this. Okay, that could be a change. It could be positive stuff, getting married, having a kid. It could be, negative stuff, changes, getting a divorce, having a business fail, whatever. It doesn't matter what it is. It causes you to go back to that refocus and readjust. And then you gain control again. And then you set a plan again. And you constantly cycle through that. And guess what? It's one of the reasons why I've worked with clients for 10 years or more. It always happens. It's happened for me. It's happened for my wife. It's happened for my mother. It's happened for my clients, because it's just, this is called being alive. it never stays the same. I tell people you live in a film strip, not a photograph. So I don't care where you are right now. I don't care if you're at the bottom of the valley and everything looks hopeless. And I don't care if you're at the top of the mountain and everything looks perfect. You're not going to be there forever. You'll either go higher or you'll go lower, or it just won't always stay the same. It's never static. And so realizing that lets you have that dynamic accountability and that dynamic cycle where then when things do change, it doesn't freak you out and make you throw everything out the window and go, backwards. Again, when we had the medical debt in the middle, by then we'd already established enough mindsets and behaviors and patterns that it's like, okay, we can do this. It set us back. That's frustrating, but we can do it. And just keep going.
Yeah, life hits us all the time, right? Like drowning in debt, those emergencies can be so stressful. They can be almost life-ending. Like it can be really tough. I didn't know you back then, but I love your positive energy now. You definitely look like and sound like you're in an amazing place. Now, what does it feel like to be in this debt-free place, accomplishing what you did? For someone who's going through it right now and imagining the other side, how does it feel to have made that accomplishment, be at this point of the mountain?
It's interesting because what I tell people I've found is contentment. And here's what I mean by that. So I think a lot of times people mistake contentment with other things. Contentment to me simply means I don't care whether it's a great month. I don't care whether it's a bad month. I don't care whether I've got 10 clients this month. I've got one client this month. Whatever it is, I can hold on to that with the attitude of this is what it is. I can see reality as real without it instilling panic or frustration or fear or any of those other things. Now, I'm going to be 100% transparent and honest. I still have those other feelings too, but they don't last. I'm able to get back to a place of center with the help of my wife and other coaches that I have in my circle, other people that speak into my life, mentors and coaches and guides and people like that. So it's this combination of contentment and yet at the same time being driven. And driven here is not for more, as in I want more stuff. But driven as in, I want to make more impact. Driven as in, I want to help more people. Driven as in, I want to, my wife and I want to be able to give more. We want to be able to do things like that. And yes, we live a comfortable life, but what drives us isn't to have a more comfortable life. What drives us is to find ways to help other people and give. For us, that's a big motivation. And so it's these sorts of things that lets you kind of balance back to having that feeling of, I had some months earlier this year that were really rough and, it's hard to get through them. And you feel like, oh man, everything's going wrong. Nothing's ever going to, you have all those thoughts. Nothing's ever going to work again. Oh, it's horrible, everything. And then you kind of get through it and you go, and you talk to your wife and you talk to other people. And, in my case, I use my wife as a sounding board and you get some help and you get support. And then you kind of come out of that funk and you're like, okay, yeah, that was stupid. It's not going to be like that forever. I'm the guy that tells everybody. But again, for me, that's why I have to surround myself for other people. Because it turns out, by the way, I'm a great coach for other people. I'm a terrible coach for myself. I cannot coach me. I have to have other people speak into me because we don't do that well. We don't coach ourselves well. It's, again, one of the reasons why I'm a big proponent for folks that need help. Find that external source of help. It could be a coach. It could be a book that you read. It could be a mentor. It could be a friend. It could be there's lots of different sources of it. You don't have to hire me. Obviously, I'd be happy if you did, but you don't have to. There's a million great coaches out there, but it's finding those sources outside of yourself to keep you sustained through it, because you'll always have that back and forth.
I guess another way to say it is this journey can mean amazing growth.
You get to a new level, all you do is find a new set of challenges.
Thank you so much, Scott, for joining us today and sharing this honestly really powerful story. For our listeners who want to connect with you and learn more about your coaching, or maybe even picked up your book, Inspired Living, where could they go?
So I actually put together a page just for your listeners. So if you go over to my website, which is inspiredstewardship.com, and then just put in /escape. And what you'll find there is there's some free resources you can download. You just put in your email, you'll get them sent right to you. Information about my book is there. I have a podcast as well. If folks want to check that out, that information is there. And there's a link where you can set up a call for me. No obligation, no pressure, nothing like that. If you just want to talk about anything you heard today or get more information about my coaching, you can do that as well. And you can find all of that again at inspiredstewardship.com/escape.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again, Scott. Appreciate you being on the show.
Thank you.
I want to thank Scott for joining us today and opening up about something so many people deal with silently. Debt doesn't just appear as a number on a statement. It shows up in behavior, in stress, and in the way we talk to the people we care about. And as we heard today, it can quietly reshape a life long before anyone else realizes what's happening. What stood out to me in Scott's story wasn't just the total debt or the interest rates. It was the way debt pushed him into hiding purchases and hiding discomfort, and even hiding his fear, even from the one he cared most about, his wife. And debt has a way of doing that. It convinces us that staying quiet is safer than admitting the reality of our situation, even though secrecy is the thing that tightens the knot. But the turning point for Scott wasn't when the debt peaked. It was when he stopped hiding and finally said it out loud. And what he expected to be a hard, painful conversation became the moment everything began to move forward. And that's an important lesson. Debt problems don't stay hidden, even when we try to bury them. Sooner or later, they show up in how we feel and how we behave. And talking about it is often the first step toward relief. We also talked today about the broader forces behind debt. We live in a consumer culture. There's a pressure to signal success everywhere we go at every moment of our lives. And the reality is that costs us so much, especially in a system where wages are rising so much slower than costs. And the fact that credit is handed out to people who have no realistic way to repay it. In that environment, debt isn't a moral failure. It's something millions of people struggle with, even though it's at no fault of their own. But even inside that system, our choices do still matter. Letting go of the need to keep up appearances frees you to make decisions that move you forward instead of sideways. When I was working at my tech job and finally making a decent salary, I continued to drive an old beat-up Mercury Sable that I inherited from my wife's grandmother. I was driving that thing into a parking lot where there were many $250,000 cars, and it took humility to do that, but that was the sacrifice that I wanted to make because I had a goal greater than what everyone thought of me when I would park that car and walk into that building. And it wasn't forever. Eventually, I bought a car that I'm very proud of. And now I have a status symbol everywhere I go. But the point was, I was making a different statement back then. And that statement was that I wasn't controlled by the system that needed to signal a certain status, especially when I hadn't yet achieved it, but was working toward it. Your plan doesn't need to be complicated. It just needs to be honest. Scott made a simple spending plan. He got his control back when it came to cash flow, and he was able to figure out how to stay consistent. And like he said, the plan rarely unfolds the way you expect, but it often works out better. When you have a plan, it sets you apart. A debt snowball, that can be a really great way to create momentum. Increasing income can be an option as well. Cutting expenses based on what matters to you. There are so many options, but there's not a single perfect method for everyone. The right plan is the one that you stick with long enough to feel that momentum, because the momentum is what makes the hard parts feel possible. But as we talked about today, getting out of debt is only half the journey. Learning to live debt-free, that's the other half. That's where the behaviors have changed. That's where the mindset has shifted. That's where you redefine what's important and what's simply habit. Plans adjust, values shift, life changes, and the financial plan has to simply keep pace. One of Scott's most important insights was this: no matter how overwhelming your debt feels, improvement is always possible. Good things can begin just as easily as they can end. And while a debt-free life isn't a stress-free life, it is a far lighter one. And because debt can be heavy, sometimes unbearably so, I want to say this clearly. If your situation has taken you to a dark or hopeless place, you are not alone. You can call or text the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline at 988 for immediate support. Reaching out is not a sign of failure. It's a sign that you are still fighting, and support is available every hour of every day. As you reflect on today's conversation, just please ask yourself, what part of your debt story needs honesty right now? Is this a conversation you've been avoiding? A number you've been afraid to look at? A habit you're finally ready to question? Or simply acknowledgement that you don't have to keep pretending that everything is fine? Whatever it is, that's where progress begins. And I'd love to hear from you. What has been your best strategy at dealing with debt? Share your thoughts in the comments or email me at contact@escapetheclock.com. Thank you for listening. Best of luck taking care of that debt and escaping the clock. I'll see you next week.
It's always fun to listen to introductions about yourself and kind of be like, wait, what? Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's me. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. It's always funny when they ask me to provide something like that. I'm like, oh, okay. But it always sounds better when it's all packaged so nicely there.
Exactly. Yeah. By the way, yeah, that's the real truth. It's like all the stuff that's unsaid. I tell people intros are kind of like Instagram photos. We make sure the dirty laundry's not in the frame when we take them.
Well, hopefully we'll get into some of that during the episode.
I'm happy to share it, actually.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode. Remember, while I'm not yet a financial planner, I am getting my degree in wealth management. You should take anything you've heard here as tips and advice to making your plan. To learn more, visit www.escapetheclock.com. There, you can find the book, resources, including the planner, and you can even schedule time with me. Please remember to like and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you next time.